Good. Well, help yourselves to the groceries that Dale and Debbie have provided for us this morning. And it looks really good, and help yourself all you can, to those. And we're going to continue our discussion in the book of Daniel. We're going to look at the next major section as I have outlined it, and you'll see that in the notes if you have a copy of those with you. But it's God's sovereignty versus Nebuchadnezzar. And this really takes us from chapter 2, verse 1 through the end of chapter 4. And it covers several incidents that took place during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar and his interactions with Daniel. So I just wondered, before we move into the lesson today, were there any points that you wanted to bring up, or any things that may have been aha moments to you from last Sunday's discussion that perhaps you'd like to address here in the class before we move forward, or any questions that somebody may have brought up to you about it?
One thing about him not allowing himself to eat food that I
Right.
looked at.
Right.
One of the reasons was, and I don't know if we touched on this, was a lot of times that meat had been offered up to their idols.
Yes.
And so therefore, taking idols of God, so they didn't take the meat and people would eat it.
Yeah.
And so that was one of the considerations, I think, that Daniel was like,
Yeah.
no, we're not going to eat that, that's
Yeah.
offered up to idols.
Yeah.
And then the other part of it was be like, you're basically conforming to or admitting that you're going to be part of this.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a personal acceptance of all that Babylon was, and as much as they had forced on them in their captivity and everything being taken from Judah and temples away from the temple worship, all of these things, they saw that by accepting and taking a personal acceptance of the king's meat, the king's wine that had been offered to idols, that it was a personal acceptance of the superiority of Babylon's gods, over Israel's gods, and they couldn't do that. They drew the line at that. And each of us will encounter that same thing in some point in our lives as we go through. We have a lot that's pushed on us, but what do we personally allow in us?
It's funny that you said draw the line, because me and Brady and Brett and Kylie, we were at the table at the bar last night talking, and we were talking all the crazy stuff. I mean, you can make a list going on.
Yeah.
And they were like, we mentioned that, at what point, when do you draw the line and say? And we were talking about some things, and they were more talking about the stuff about the Epstein and all of that, and then we were talking about it. When do you draw the line? And I said, well, there are some things you just know.
Yeah.
And it's no matter what, it's no.
Yeah.
But there's some things, and I said, if you're really in the Bible and you're really where you just get this feeling and you know when it's wrong.
Yeah.
And I said, you will know when it's wrong.
Yeah.
That's the problem. There's a lot of people that don't know that they're doing stuff wrong.
Yeah, they're not in the book. They're not in the Bible. And Daniel was in the Word, and that's what gave him that strength and understanding. Yeah.
Because even Brett at his young age cannot even fathom how some of the stuff with children could even possibly go on,
Mm-hmm.
And I was kind of thinking, well, at least, as a parent, you're always looking for signs that you might have done one thing right,
Yeah. Yeah.
But I was like, in the way he talked, because we were joking most of the time, but I was like, he really does know. I mean, he knows when something's wrong.
Yeah.
So that's why I think as a parent, you have to, or even as a person, as a Christian, people are watching you, and when you know something's wrong, not only do you not need to do it, but people are watching you that you don't even know are watching to see if you're going to do it.
Yeah, and that was Paul's point in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 when he was talking about, some things are lawful but not expedient. And sometimes there are issues and there are situations where it's not so much whether something is really good or bad, but what is the impression, what is the testimony that I'm leaving with these other people about what I believe. And that's where it comes in that Paul said, you know, we know idols are nothing. But if you know meat's been offered to an idol for the sake of the other person's conscience, not yours, but the other person's conscience, you leave it alone. Because it's a matter of what you want to testify to that individual about your belief in your God, and idolatry is wrong. Yeah.
One thing that goes on with what David said here, this commentary I was looking at, he talked about, he said Daniel did not object to the name that was given to him, because he knew who he was. And others called him what they wanted. Daniel did not object to the Babylonian education, because he knew what he believed. Daniel did object to the food from the king's table, because he knew it was direct disobedience to God's word. So,
Yeah.
goes on with
Yeah.
you know, that he was indoctrinated in the Babylonian culture.
Mhm.
He given new names, whatever. You read it, he didn't really say anything about his new name.
No.
And he was like, I was like, oh, when I read that, I was like, mate,
Yeah.
that's,
Yeah.
he knew who he was.
Yeah.
He called me whatever he wanted to, and I know who I am.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, and his education and all these things that he was taught to believe.
Sure.
Yeah, he didn't, I mean, he learned them. Don't necessarily have to believe them, have to
No.
go along with them, but I can learn it.
Yeah. And I think that's really useful for us as we live in the increasingly pressurized world that we're living in that's against Christianity, that we may be forced into some situations, our jobs, people we have to associate with, whatever it might be, that we are forced into those situations where we might otherwise, if we had our own druthers, not be there. Nevertheless, we don't have that option, and we're there. And yes, we can know the language, we can, you know, all this other stuff, but where, you know, the line comes in as to where you make it personally yours. Yeah.
This kind of goes along with Debbie too. We've talked to our grandkids before, kids from, whether they like it or not, or believe it or not, they influence people every day.
Yeah.
And so, you know, we try to get them to see, and I did read this in a devotional the other day, when they lay down at night, they need to think about their day and the decisions they made that day. How many of those affected people positively, and how many did you influence negatively? Because either way,
Yeah.
you influence people by what you do.
Yeah,
All of
that's
it.
true. Yeah, yeah. And you know, and Daniel was looking at the bigger picture. A lot of people would say, well, Daniel just should have said, no, I ain't doing this. But he was looking at the larger picture of what is the message I want to leave to the king, the people that I'm around. Yeah, I could say I ain't going to do it, and they'd cut me up, throw me to the lions or whatever it was, and it'd be over. But how can I leave a lasting testimony? And that's when he went to the compromise. Test us for 10 days.
And there's a right way and a wrong way.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, you don't have to compromise what you believe, but there is a right way and a wrong way to get it.
To present it.
Because
Yeah.
some people are, you know, you just bullheaded.
Yeah, they see the bullheaded rather than the testimony. You know,
Me and Hal Work has been studying that on Jehovah's Witness, because I accidentally.
bless your heart.
Yeah. I accidentally hired one, and because I was ignorant to their beliefs, I really didn't have nothing to say to the guy when he would tell me about King James being tired of this and this
No,
and this
yeah,
and this.
yeah.
So now, between me and Rob, we got enough ammunition, we're gonna sit down with this guy, and he's gonna quit or convert the next time.
Uh-huh.
So it's good to know everything you know about your enemy, because that's the only way sometimes you can turn or defeat them, is to know their good parts, their bad parts, and their weaknesses.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And all of that is just being smart. You know, I've mentioned this, I don't know, I guess 100 times over the years that I've been teaching here at the class. You know, Jesus said, be wise as serpents, but harmless as doves. So, you know, in dealing with the world, we got to be on our toes.
You heard it, Brad. Almost as does.
That would be that guy's choice to quit, not Brad's to fire, you know. But we have to be wise. We have to really figure, how do we need to approach? Do we just live it, or do we say something? Which will leave the better testimony in the longer run? And if you're backed into a corner, like Daniel was about prayer in chapter 6 when we get there, he could have shut the window, but that was his custom to do it. And in his conscience, he couldn't do that. And so he opened the window. They saw him, got you, feed you to the lions. Well, and he didn't try to get out of it.
But even beyond, but even that's the trap that they knew that they could get him because they knew he wouldn't compromise.
Yeah.
They knew that that's what he did. And so they made this law
Just specifically for him. Yeah.
Just specifically.
And that was a testimony in itself, because they said, and we'll cover it good when we get there, but they said, we will not be able to attack him except in the belief of his God. Now, if people don't like me, and if that can be the reason, I think, a little vanity, I'd be ready to pat myself on the back, because I give a lot of people a lot of reason not to like me other than the fact of how I am a Christian. But what a testimony that was. He did his job. He fulfilled his role. He did what he was supposed to do. And that was a testimony. As Paul said, was it to Colossians or to the Philippians, everything you do in word or deed, do all for the glory of God. Work your job for the glory of God. How do you do that? You do your job. It's not that complicated, but you just do your job. And it leaves a testimony. Once again, the influence that you show and share with others. So, I think this is great. We can redo the whole lesson next week. That'd be good. I can flip over a couple of pages and we can pick it up again. But this is great, because I really think that in the world and the time in which we're living in, it ain't going to get any better. Daniel talks to us about how do you manage to live under the domination of the world. He was under the domination of Babylon. So how do I survive? And where do I draw the line that says, okay, God, if I survive, you're going to have to do it, because...
And that's where our faith and trust comes.
Yeah.
I mean, really comes.
Yeah.
Into play.
It does.
Because it's probably coming quicker than we think it's coming.
Yeah, it is.
And it goes right to the song they sung this morning, There Was Jesus.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, I couldn't help but think when I was singing it, I think of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego standing in front of that fiery furnace.
Mm-hmm.
It's like through all that you go through in life, the good, bad, and ugly, when you're there in the bad, man, it's like, hey, you throw us in that fire and our God can save us if you want to, but if you don't, he's still God.
Yeah.
We're not going to do it.
And we're still delivered.
Yeah.
It might look a little crispy, but we're still delivered.
And it's just, wow, how powerful it was to hear them singing that, and you think, I knew Teresa had been back there, was listening, and I'm thinking about all that she's gone through, he's going through, and then to hear that message in that song, I was like, wow, how powerful that is. And then, you think about your own life, it's like, wow, situations that I've been through, and mess I've gotten into, and then yet, God got me out of it, got me through it. These guys are standing right there in that fire, and it's like, God's going to save me or he's not, but he's going to get me through it, because guess what? Like that guy said, we know the end.
Yeah.
We know where
We read the end of the story. Yeah. Yeah.
Remember that whenever.
Yeah.
We know who wins.
And we know who wins. Yeah. Yeah. We know who wins. So, and I think that's part of some of the value of the book of Daniel. Most of the time when we think of Daniel, we think of all the prophecies, and and we probably won't get into it today, but the vision that Nebuchadnezzar had, the dream, and so forth and so on. And that's what we mainly think about. But there's so much in Daniel that talks to us about just how to make it day by day in certain situations and certain circumstances. And that's really part of the wonderful value of this book. So great discussion, great conversation. So let's kind of get into this just a little bit. We'll get into chapter 2 and And he's laid the foundation for the rest of the book in chapter 1. Okay, the historical basis out of that history to validate the fact that God's in control and God has already fulfilled his promises. So that is saying that the rest that you're going to read in this book is true because God has already shown that he has fulfilled his word. Now, Daniel moves into the conflict, as good a word as any, between God and Nebuchadnezzar. And as we move into chapter 2, verse 1 presents us with something that looks like a contradiction. New International Version, of course. In the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind was troubled, and he could not sleep. Now, you remember back in chapter 1, they were told that they were going to be trained for 3 years and examined and then accepted into the king's service. But now we have Nebuchadnezzar having this dream in the second year, and it seems that, was Daniel pressed into service before ever being vetted by the king? Or, people have used this as an attack on Scripture. This was a contradiction. Now, there's a couple of possible solutions to this. Probably the most likely is that Daniel's training period was included in Nebuchadnezzar's accession year. In that time, when kings came to the throne, whenever they came to the throne, from that point to the beginning of the next year or the new year, this was called the king's accession year. Because he is seated to the throne, he's taking his position, he's cleaning up whatever mess he wants to clean up and all this. And then at the anniversary or at the beginning of the new year, you would have his first year. And then at the next new year, the beginning of his second year. So that's probably how it looked to have have Nebuchadnezzar into his second year. Well, you still have 3 years. So by the time you reach Nebuchadnezzar's second year, Daniel and the 3 Hebrews were in their third year. So, it's not a contradiction. You have to kind of look into some of the history to see it, to see how that could be. Also, another option to this is the fact that in Hebrew reckoning, any part of a day or of a year was considered a year. Now, they came in the third month, I think it was. In the third year of the reign, Nebuchadnezzar, didn't say when it was. But in the third year, so it's whenever in that third year, that would, in the Jewish reckoning, constitute the whole year. So even if it was just a part of a year. Now we look at it, if you're going to say it's a year, it's 365 days. Well, not everybody looks at it that way. So they could have had, this would have been the first year, this would have been the second year, this would have been the third year. So they could have had 1 full year of training and 2 partial years, and it still would have been 3 years as far as both the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, and or the Hebrews, thinking about that. So that's 2 possible options. And a third could be that he was pressed into service, but it really presents a problem trying to harmonize at the end of the set time, verse 18, which would have been the 3 years, and then 2 years. So this is probably the best, solution to the issue, and this would come a close second or first, whichever one, you would see to choose with that. So it's just interesting. And Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. And this one dream bothered his mind to the point of not being able to sleep. Now, it's quite interesting here to see that, once again, how God uses the basic elements of life. Sleep, you don't sleep, you have a dream, you don't have a dream. Somebody's stealing sheep, what do you do with it? You wash in the Jordan, or you spit and make mud, put it on people's eyes. How God uses the basic elements of life to set the stage, for his will and word to come forth as he's revealed it in Scripture. And remember, Nebuchadnezzar wasn't the only one who couldn't couldn't sleep, and God used it. Later on, we read in Esther, when we went through Esther, the king couldn't sleep. And that's what ultimately led to the defeat of Haman and his problem, because king couldn't sleep that night, and he asked for the royal books to be read to bore him to death. And it was recorded that Mordecai had revealed those that were going to try to assassinate him. And he said, what has been done for him? They said, well, not anything has been done. Then Haman comes on the scene, and he says, I got something for you to do. I want you to honor somebody. And of course, Haman, being the vain person that he is, who's better to be honored than me? And he's all happy about it until he says, I want you to go get Mordecai the Jew and lead him around and proclaim how great he is. So even, God is able to use this. And, these are just elements of God's providence in action. Couldn't sleep that night. Well, why couldn't you sleep? I don't know, I just had a bad night. Well, it could well be that God is using that in some way, for some purpose. God's providence works through multitudes of little bitty steps to bring about his will. And Nebuchadnezzar having a dream that night and got so troubled by it, couldn't sleep. So the king summoned the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, and the astrologers to tell him what he had dreamed. When they came in and stood before the king, he said to them, I have had a dream that troubles me, and I want to know what it means. So, Nebuchadnezzar, having this very troubling dream.
Was it just one time he had this dream?
Probably.
Just one hitting that hard?
Yeah, probably. Yeah. That would be my guess.
Yeah.
That this was so powerful a dream that, it really shook him. And he does what would have been natural for the king to do. He calls for those whom he regarded as having the ability to tell him what he dreamed, to explain it to him. And this would include the dream as well as the message of the dream. And in this, we're introduced to two more types of pagan practitioners in Babylon. Remember last week, there were two that were brought out to us, magicians and enchanters, verse 20. And then now we're introduced to sorcerers and astrologers. Now, a sorcerer in ancient Babylon practiced witchcraft. And this was something not to be afraid of. This was something to be sought after, because they could read omens and they could counter spells and stuff like this for the benefit of the king and the Chaldeans. So witchcraft was something that was accepted in that land. And the astrologers, or as the King James Version has it, Chaldeans, was the name of a group of people who were the primary tribe of the Babylonian Empire. And because of their position, they were most likely, took this position of being astrologers. Now, these were the pagans who studied the stars and the planets and comets and the physical elements of the cosmos. They were, in many ways, they were early scientists. And they were the wise men of the land, and they developed manuals that could actually explain what this symbol meant in the dream that you had, because, as we have studied the stars and blah, blah. So, when this group was called by the king, the astrologers kind of led the discussion. They're the ones who spoke up first. And they said, tell your servants the dream, and we'll interpret it. And the king replied to the astrologers, this is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me what my dream was and interpret it, I will have you cut into pieces and your houses turned into piles of rubble. In other words, a dung house was that piles of rubble. That's what that really is saying. But if you tell me the dream and explain it, you will receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. So tell me the dream and interpret it for me. Now, if it had been custom, to tell the dream and then, have these wise people interpret it, Why do you think Nebuchadnezzar balked at this? Why did he kind of break out of the tradition or the norm and say, I ain't telling you the dream. You tell me the dream and interpret it?
We don't know if he had dreams before or not. What I'm seeing here is this dude's smart. This guy's like, you can tell me anything you want to if I tell you what I dreamed. But if you know as much as you say you do, and if you can, then you will be able to tell me what the dream was, and then you're going to interpret it for me.
Yeah, and that goes back to Mike's question about was this one or several dreams. This was so troubling. This one dream had so much power to it. He said, no, I want you to tell me what I dreamed. And then you interpret it for me. And as was often in Nebuchadnezzar's, way of doing things, he gave them a twofold option. If you do not, then it ain't going to be good to be you. But if you tell me this, then I'm going to just reward you. No pressure, Tell me the dream.
He really did trust him a whole lot.
No. And I think as we get into the nature of the dream, we realize why he balked at this so much. You remember that in the dream, at the end of it, there's this stone that smashes everything. And Nebuchadnezzar could have been thinking, well, somebody going to try to kill me? Somebody going to try to assassinate me? And are you part of the plot already? Tell me the dream. And, it's almost funny to see this go through, because as we begin in verse 7, once more they replied, let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will interpret it. Then the king answered, I am certain that you're stalling, people, because you realize that this is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me the dream, there is just one penalty for you. Mercy wasn't a big, strong point with Nebuchadnezzar, You have conspired to tell me misleading and wicked things, hoping the situation will change. In other words, I'll change my mind and tell you what the dream is. That's right. So then, tell me the dream, and I will know that you can interpret it for me. The astrologers answered the king, there is not a man on earth who can tell or who can do what the king asks. No king, however great and mighty. Talk about walking out on thin ice with a blowtorch.
He knows he's going to die anyway.
Yeah. I'm going to tell him, I'm going to get my swing in, No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or astrologer. What the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, and they do not live among men. Now, for people who were supposed to be, and in all probability were very smart people, you just can't fix stupid here. The fallacy of their paganism was totally exposed. They asked him, explain the dream. King saw what it was, accused them of conspiracy and misleading. And he may have really thought, this crowd is going to assassinate me. That's why I saw the stone, because he didn't know what it meant. He just remembered that's what he had seen. And Babylonian kings and ancient kings in general, many times did not live a long life. In the Babylonian Empire, of the 3 kings that were the primary kings during this time, 2 of the 3 were assassinated. So, as we say today, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean somebody's not out to get you. And they sealed their own doom in verses, 10, 11. And they basically said, only the gods can answer this, and they ain't here, and by extension, we don't know how to talk to them. That's what you were hired for. That's what you got the position for. And now you're telling me you have no contact with the world that you said you knew.
But they also set the stage for how powerful God is.
Yes, only the gods can tell you this. Yeah, Daniel's going to say, I know one. You know. So we live in a world that rejects the knowledge of God. It leans toward the paranormal, aliens, science, and all that other stuff. And the acceptance of the paranormal is an acceptance of spirit beings apart from God. And the only ones who inhabit this state are demonic powers. And, you know, we often think of demonic powers as, and we think of Legion, you know, cutting himself and living among the tombs and all this other stuff. But Paul talks about angels of light, deceptors. And as we look at the amount of television, movies, so forth, that projects magic and paranormalism and all this other stuff, you know, we just have to be aware. I'm not saying don't watch it. I'm just saying be aware of what you're looking at. No matter how pretty it is, you know, fashioned, it's still talking about a world of spiritism apart from God. And it's interesting. I saw a tagline on my phone this week, and you know if it's on the iPhone, it's got to be, you know, gospel truth. Totally facetious in that statement, but, you know. But one of the things that somebody said that was another element of whiteness was the belief in a single deity. Now, I don't care what you are promoting and who has been wronged and what color they are. They can be chartreuse. It makes no difference. That is what is ultimately behind it. It is getting at the Christian belief in Jesus Christ as the Son of God and a monotheistic religion. That is what, that is an exposition, that is an exposing of what really is lying at the crux of it. And that's what we have to watch for. And this is what is being fostered on us. And, you know, science can tell us a lot of things. But there was a scientist, an astronomer in Babylon in 500 BC. Maybe one of these guys who lived through this, thanks to Daniel, that calculated the length of a year. 500 BC, 2,500 years ago, he calculated that the average year is 365 days, 6 hours, 15 minutes, and 41 seconds. In 2017, science said, because the Earth wobbles a little bit as it goes around every year, and it changes some, that the year in 2017 was 365 days, 6 hours, and 9 minutes. Not much improvement. I mean, there were smart people back then. We often think of the ancients as being, you know, Neanderthals dragging their knuckles across the ground and stuff like this. They were smart. We can't do today what they did then. 4,000 years ago, we can't do. But all of that science still doesn't mean that you have discovered the creator of it all. You still worship the creature. Science can tell you a whole lot about life, but it can't tell you how to have peace with God. And, you know, this is part of what is being revealed in this. And, of course, Nebuchadnezzar, as was so true for good old Nebuchadnezzar, Verse 12, this made the king so angry and furious that he ordered the execution of all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree was issued to put the wise men to death, and men were sent to look for Daniel and his friends to put them to death. They weren't even a part of this yet. They hadn't even been vetted. But it didn't make any difference. Just because you're a newbie, that doesn't mean that you don't, when Nebuchadnezzar says kill them all, he meant kill them all. So, he classed everybody as the same. We would call that stereotyping today, And it was bad back then, and it's bad today to take one small group and then, make a generalized statement about everybody. And remember, these guys were probably at the oldest now. 17, 18 years old at the very oldest. If that old. They could have been even younger.
It just hit me, I realized it's just the second year of his reign. So, yeah, he's got a lot of advisors and stuff that was there during his father's time. And so he's probably really suspicious as to who you loyal to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And some of these people could have been captives as well, just like Daniel and the 3 other Hebrews. And he's thinking, I got a dream that's letting me know somebody's going to get rid of me, and I want to know who it is. And it could be all of you because you won't tell me the dream. Now, imagine the consternation of Daniel and the 3 Hebrews. Let's just pick up in verse 14. When Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, had gone out to put to death the wise men of Babylon, Daniel spoke to him with wisdom and tact. And he asked the king's officer, why did the king issue such a harsh decree? And Arioch then explained the matter to Daniel. At this, Daniel went into the king and asked for time so that he might interpret the dream for him. Now, if you knew, word got to you, or you saw the guard coming through the door that said, because you were part of this group, the king has decided you've got to die, I would imagine calmness and wisdom and tact would probably be somewhere down on the list. I would imagine people knowing Nebuchadnezzar for who he was were pretty shook up about this. And that would be the natural thing for most any of us.
I think this guard, he knew Daniel though. He knew how he was, how he worked with others and all that. I think he come in there calm and sadly that this was going to happen.
Yeah.
I think he also knew that Daniel wasn't part of the crowd that was there before the king. He's just like a byproduct of the...
He's just having to do his job, and he probably didn't like it,
And he goes to Daniel first,
Yeah.
before all the other magicians and astrologers. He's going to Daniel.
Yeah. So, Arioch, and here again, providence. Arioch didn't owe Daniel anything. I mean, he was under orders from the man that you don't say, well, I decided I wasn't going to kill Daniel. That wouldn't have worked too well, as furious as Nebuchadnezzar was.
It's interesting that he even let him go to the king.
Yeah.
We ain't got more to lose that.
No, that Arioch would even let Daniel go see the king.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you kind of wonder why did he even do this?
I mean, why did he?
It was providence of God.
It's God's hand.
It's God's hand. And how many times have, we can look back as you watch History channels and different documentaries, things like this. How many times have they made statements about, well, Hitler or Mussolini or Tojo, whoever it was, they didn't do this. Although it would have made a lot of sense at the time to do it. And, they just go on. This is one of the reasons why they lost. Yeah, a little bit of that providence coming in there. Why didn't Hitler build heavy, long-distance bombers. He never did. He didn't think he needed them. Could it have been, I'm just totally supposing, I can't prove a thing of it. Could it have been something whispering in his cocaine-filled mind? You don't need to do this. Because he was injected with coke and stuff like this. He was high a lot. And he was crazy. And that doesn't help. But could it have been, as we will see in chapter 10, that there are angelic forces working in the governments and the situations of this world? We just got to, chapter 10 pulls the curtain back just enough for us to say, how does he do that? And that's all we're told. Could it have been something like that?
Even Pearl Harbor, they just kept coming.
If they'd have kept coming, they could have come on to California. If they'd have just kept coming. But no, they figured it was, our element of surprise had been broken, so we need to call it off. Several times in the Pacific, if they had just done a little more, we might would have still won the war, but it would have taken a lot longer and cost us a lot more boys. I mean, you just kind of think about the hand of providence and apply that to our own lives. God is working, and we've talked about it, and I've drawn it up here and all this, so many times you're probably tired of hearing about it, that there's so many of those little points that God uses all along the path of our life to bring us to certain situations. And in those situations, all of a sudden, there's a crossroads. We are brought, something is brought across our path, or we're brought across somebody else's path to be able to provide a witness. And this is something of what we're seeing here. And Daniel spoke to this guy with wisdom and tact. Sometimes the most powerful testimony comes from just the demeanor we demonstrate when the world is falling apart around us. How many times have you gone to somebody or somebody gone to you and they were like, blah! And how you like that when that shows out on the video, when people see. And they're like that, and you're able, in a calm, strong, sound way, to help them work through it. How many times is that? So, Daniel went in before Nebuchadnezzar, asked for time, and committed himself to interpret the dream. Daniel knew that God had given him the gift. And now he saw why. But, notice, Scripture doesn't say anything about the other three going in with him. Now, not that they were scared, but Daniel was the one who had the gift. And they already knew. It don't pay to tell the king you know something and you can't follow through. You can't produce it, Ask the other astrologer.
He couldn't do it by himself. He asked him for the friend.
Yes. And that goes to the point that, even though Daniel was given, it wasn't something that was automatic, like, okay, let me pull my vision interpreter out of the pocket here and tell you what's going on. The operations, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 12, the operations, and 14, the operations of the Spirit are His. The manifestations of the Spirit are God's to use. Even though God gifted Daniel with this, it wasn't just automatic, or Daniel could have said it right then. So listen, this is what happened, this is what happened, this. He had to seek the Lord for it. You have to realize that this is not something that you build your own psychic hotline career around, And Daniel's going to eventually tell him that the reason I know this, and O king, you've been told this, is because God chose it. Not because you're so great, and by implication that I'm so holy, but God chose to show you this. He'll tell him that in the latter part of chapter 2.
But even the king respected him enough to give him time. He would give him up with no time.
Yeah.
Right now.
Yeah. Yeah. So as he had already, talked with them, knew that they were smart, once again, it's got to be providence. It's got to be God working on this guy.
I still see in here hints that Nebuchadnezzar did not trust the old regime. And here you got Daniel and his guys. These are new guys that he's been training, and they've come from and they don't have loyalties, they don't have ties to the old regime. And so maybe he was a little more, obviously, he was more lenient to these guys because he'd already
Something helped persuade him. Yeah.
And then you got this guy goes in there, Daniel asks, what's going on? What's the deal? And the guy's, well, the king's going to kill you guys. And he's like, why?
Yeah. What did I do?
And then Daniel actually has access to go straight to the king to talk to him.
Yeah.
Again, I'm going,
Providence.
why? Because if he's already made the decree for these guys to be killed, why ain't he killing on the spot?
Yeah. Yeah.
But instead, they had a conversation, and Daniel goes, oh, and he has direct access to Nebuchadnezzar. And I can't help but think that it's partially because of what you just saying there. Obviously, it's God's
Providence.
dominance, but at the same time, Nebuchadnezzar trusts these guys more than I see him trusting these guys more than he does these older guys.
Yeah. And that would have been part of,
These guys don't want to take their home.
and that would have been part of that providence that God blessed their natural abilities and gave them that added wisdom, so that when they answered, when Nebuchadnezzar gave them the oral exam, they were 10 times better, and he remembered that. So all of these little points come playing in together. Why did Nebuchadnezzar not just say, okay, here's one right here, go ahead and kill him, then find the rest of them? He could have.
It sounds like that's the decree that he gave them.
Yeah. He said, do I have to say it twice? He wasn't one to say, well, I'm thinking maybe I'll kill somebody. No.
Reckon the guard opened the door, pushed him in and shut it.
I wouldn't be surprised about that either, because, if he'd have been angry about Daniel being there, he'd have been angry about, why did you bring him in here, type thing. But it's just the working, the manipulation, if you will, in a positive sense, the manipulation by God of the circumstances for 3 years prior, coming up to this, to where Nebuchadnezzar said, oh, yeah, you're one of those Hebrews, ain't you? You're one of the ones that I talked to here recently that was so smart. You want me to give you some time to tell me the dream? Okay, I'll give you time. And after Daniel committed to revealing the dream, he went to this house and enlisted the help of his friends to plead for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery. You would think he would have said, yo, guys, come here, let's kind of powwow here a little bit. How am I going to approach? No. He believed in God. He knew whom he trusted. And then he says, oh, by the way, guys, I told the king we were going to, tell him what the dream was. I want you to pray about this thing tonight, because although it's not stated, I'm sure it was time limited from Nebuchadnezzar. He probably gave him to the next day. Said, okay, now you either going to cough it up or I'm going to take your head, So Daniel knew that his gift wasn't something that was constant. He couldn't turn it on and off. And Daniel and his friends prayed for the revelation of the dream, not just to live, which was, pretty good reason enough, but to example the power of the God of the Jews over the pagan idols of Babylon. The Holy Spirit always looks to glorify the Father or the Son. Jesus said, he will speak of me. He will not speak of himself. John chapter 14. He will not speak of himself. He will speak of me. The work of the Holy Spirit is always to glorify, even though he is God, to glorify God the Father, and in the New Testament, God the Son, along with that. So, wonderful stuff, wonderful theology right here in the book of Daniel. So, that's probably about all I'm going to give you because we really want to get into that dream. And there's a lot there. This is the foundational dream of everything else. We're going to hear about these kingdoms in the rest of the book. This lays the foundation for it. And there'll be some good stuff in there. So thank you for the discussion, questions, comments, all that. And we'll see you next week.